And I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands, and so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. Wow, just let those words sink in for a second, right? This isn't some line from a gritty dystopian movie. This is a real, visceral, first-hand account from the 14th century. We're talking about a man who was literally watching his entire universe collapse around him. It really instantly grounds us in the devastating emotional reality of a disease that completely shattered the medieval world.
And when we zoom out from that one heartbreaking personal story, we hit this staggering figure. 200 million. That's the upper estimate of lives lost globally to the bubonic plague. To really contextualize the sheer, incomprehensible scale of this disruption, you have to remember that the global population back then was just a fraction of what it is today. I mean, in many regions, up to half the population just vanished, gone, in a matter of a few years. It was an absolute apocalyptic event that fundamentally altered the trajectory of human history. So, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most transformative events in human history. We are looking at the Black Death, or as they actually called it back then, the Great Mortality. But hey, we aren't just going to look at this as a horrific tragedy. No, we're going to explore how this massive demographic shock acted as the ultimate catalyst for human evolution, literally reshaping medicine, religion, and the global economy. Okay, here's our agenda for today. 1. The Great Mortality. 2. Medical myths and desperate cures. 3. Faith, fear, and fatalism. 4. The Great Economic Transition. And finally, 5. The Plague Today.
So, diving right into Section 1, The Great Mortality, a World in Contagion. You know, the terrifying speed at which the plague engulfed the interconnected medieval world is just staggering. It essentially hitched a ride on human trade routes. It breaks out in the Crimea in 1346, then by the autumn of 1347, plague ships arrive in Alexandria, Egypt, and then, bam, September 1348, it strikes Cairo. Now, to put that into perspective, Cairo was the biggest city in the Mediterranean region at the time, way larger than any city in Europe. The result? Cairo lost roughly 200,000 people. That is a full third of its population. The disruption was so immense that whole neighborhoods were left as empty ruins for a century. The pandemic only slowly subsided around 1353, leaving behind a completely altered landscape.
All right, moving on to Section 2, Medical Myths and Desperate Cures.
Well, when a catastrophe of this magnitude hits, obviously you turn to your doctors. But to understand the medieval medical response, we really have to wrap our heads around the prevailing medical theory of the time, known as humorism. So humorism was this ancient concept championed way back by Hippocrates, proposing that human health and even your personality are controlled by the balance of 4 specific bodily liquids. This theory completely, and I mean completely, misdirected all medical responses to the plague. Physicians weren't looking for an external infectious agent like we would today. They were looking inward, desperately trying to fix a liquid imbalance.
And these 4 humors were blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Doctors firmly believed that a deadly sickness, even something as gruesome as the bubonic plague, was simply an imbalance of these internal liquids. So, their treatments? They didn't focus on isolation or hygiene, no way. Instead, they focused heavily on things like bloodletting, literally using leeches or cutting a patient to drain out the quote-unquote excess blood under the tragic assumption that they were restoring balance. In reality, they were just weakening patients who were already dying.
And if bloodletting wasn't bad enough, the absolute desperation led to some incredibly unscientific and frankly absurd measures. Say you had severe neurological symptoms. A doctor might actually prescribe trepanning. Step 1, drill a hole in the patient's skull. Step 2, release the trapped demons causing the illness. Yeah, actually not exactly an FDA-approved method today, right? In other instances, doctors prescribed eating the seeds of the skullcap plant to cure head-related ailments, for the highly scientific reason that the seeds physically looked like tiny human skulls. They were totally grasping at straws in the dark.
Underpinning all of this chaos was the miasma theory. This theory argued that disease is spread by bad air emanating from rotting organic matter. This is exactly why you see those infamous plague doctors wearing those bird beak masks stuffed with sweet-smelling flowers. They literally thought if they couldn't smell the bad air, they wouldn't catch the disease. Contrast that with germ theory, which is our modern understanding. We now know the plague is caused by the Yersinia pestis bacteria, usually transmitted by infected fleas on rodents. But get this, humanity didn't even isolate that bacteria until 1894. For centuries, they were fighting an invisible enemy with incense and guesswork.
Which brings us to Section 3, Faith, Fear, and Fatalism.
So, with medicine completely failing them, society experienced this massive ideological shift. Different cultures processed the exact same trauma through their specific theological lenses. The historical records show two starkly contrasting official religious doctrines. The Christian response generally framed the plague as a harsh punishment sent by God for humanity's sins. This actually led to movements like the Flagellants, who whipped themselves in public penitence to try and appease God's wrath. But the official Muslim response in the Middle East framed the plague quite differently. If it struck a devout Muslim, authorities officially viewed it as a sign of divine favor, granting the victim the revered status of a martyr. Throughout this explainer, it's just so fascinating to see how the exact same biological event was officially interpreted as a curse in one region and a blessing in another.
However, official theological doctrine is one thing, human nature is a whole different ballgame. Take a look at this desperate plea from the Muslim writer Ibn al-Wardi. He wrote, "God is my security in every adversity. Save us for his sake from the attacks of the plague, and give us shelter." So despite the official stance that the plague was a blessing for the faithful, individuals on the ground were utterly terrified. Fear of death is universal, you know? People of all faiths prayed, panicked, and fled their cities, pretty much proving that when mortality is staring you right in the face, human survival instincts almost always override official doctrine.
Let's shift gears to Section 4, the Great Economic Transition.
As the dust finally settled and millions lay dead, the world had to rebuild, pivoting from immense tragedy to some really fascinating systemic evolution. By tracking the book holdings of Harvard libraries by century, which researchers like Bruce Campbell use as a proxy for intellectual production and economic development, we can see something wild. The post-plague disruption unexpectedly catalyzed a great transition. While the initial shock was obviously devastating, the resulting institutional changes in Europe, particularly what would become Atlantic Europe, sparked an incredible rise in economic and intellectual growth that eventually outpaced other regions. It's like the plague acted as a brutal reset button that completely shifted the global balance of power and innovation.
So how and why did that transition actually happen? It is honestly one of history's greatest paradoxes. Think about it. In the pre-plague era, you had a high population, but wages were super low, and living conditions for the average peasant were incredibly poor. Feudalism had them totally trapped. But in the post-plague era, the population is heavily depleted. Suddenly, you have a massive labor shortage on your hands. If you were a surviving craftsman or peasant, your value skyrocketed overnight. You could demand higher wages, better food, and vastly improved living conditions. The mass death inadvertently shattered that rigid feudal system, paving the way for greater societal mobility and laying the very early economic groundwork for the Renaissance.
Okay, Section 5, the plague today.
Now, you might be thinking this is all safely in the past, but the Black Death is absolutely not just ancient history. Just look at the year 2019. The United States saw exactly one case of the bubonic plague. It does still exist in wildlife in places like the American Southwest, but human infection is incredibly rare and super easily treated with basic antibiotics. Contrast that with Madagascar, though, which saw nearly 3,000 cases. Why the huge difference? Because today the plague is fundamentally a disease of poverty and infrastructure. In Madagascar, a lack of access to medical care, dense living conditions with poor sanitation, and traditional cultural burial practices, which can sometimes involve exhuming bodies and putting people in direct contact with the still living Yersinia pestis bacteria, creates severe seasonal outbreaks. The bacteria hasn't gone anywhere. What's changed is our systemic vulnerability to it.
Which leaves us with this final, vital question to ponder. When the next great plague arrives, will we be ready? The Black Death showed us that diseases don't just kill. They test the absolute limits of our medicine, our social safety nets, our beliefs, and our economies. Sure, we have germ theory now, we have antibiotics, but as we've all seen with recent global events, human behavior, fear, and systemic inequalities are often just as potent as the pathogens themselves. So looking back at the 14th century isn't just about studying the past. It's absolutely crucial for preparing our systems for the future. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.